Recording. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're well. Today is Wednesday. It is December the 6th, and we're getting ready for Parshas Vayeshev as well as Shabbos Chanukah. So we're going to look at some sources today that are both going to be dealing with Parshas Vayeshev as well as Chanukah. So here we go. Let me just tell her I can't respond now. I'm sorry about this. Okay, so let's see. We're going to look at something I saw this year that I was unaware of before, but I found this fascinating. I hope you will as well. So there's so much information in Parshas Vayeshev. We're going to deal with today, there's the sale of Yosef by his brothers, and we're going to deal with today particularly challenging part of that, which was when he found himself in Egypt and he rose to a very great position of prominence, managing the estate and all the affairs of Potiphar. Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him, and he had to deal with that. So I want to share with you something I found this year that I don't know if I was aware of before. So let's look at several psukim. This is the narrative is picking up after Yosef has been sold. It says, V'Yosef hurad Mitzrayma. So Yosef was brought down to Egypt by the caravans of Ishmaelites who had taken him and sold him. V'kneu Potiphar sris paro sar tabachim. He was purchased as a slave by Potiphar, who was one of the big officers of Paro, Sarah Tabachim, chief of the slaughterers. According to some, he was his chief executioner. Ish Mitzri, he was an Egyptian. Miyada Ishmaelim, he was bought from the Ishmaelites. Asher Horidu Shama, who had brought Yosef down. Beis, Vayi Hashem es Yosef, God was with Yosef, Vayi Ish Matzliach, and he was very successful. V'beves Adonav HaMitzri, and he found himself in the house of his Egyptian master. Vayar Adonav ki Hashem ito. His master sees that God is with him, is that Yosef is an extremely successful person. He's got a lot of skills. He's capable. Any activity that Yosef engages in, God helped him prosper. So he realizes this is a very good person to have in charge of all my affairs. Daled. Yosef found favor in his eyes, and he served him faithfully. So he appoints him to be in charge of his entire house, his estate. And everything that he has, he gave over into Yosef's hands. Hey, and it was as soon as Yosef was put in charge of his house, his property, so as soon as Yosef found himself in charge of Paro's house, he found himself to be successful. Everything that he was in charge of, he was successful. So he says, and he was successful in everything that he was doing in the house and in the field. So he, at this point, he trusts Yosef, so he puts him in charge of everything. Says, I'm not gonna micromanage you. You've got everything. And he wasn't involving himself in anything that Yosef was in charge of. The only thing he was involved with was the bread that he ate. And Yosef was very handsome and he had beautiful complexion. Now, what does that mean? That the only thing he held back that he wasn't involved in was the bread that he ate? So many of the commentators say that's basically a euphemism for his wife. That Potiphar says, you've got free reign over my house. There's just one area where I don't trust you and where you're not allowed to get involved. And that was basically saying with his wife. So Yosef didn't need to be told that. Yosef grew up in a God-fearing home. But that's saying from Potiphar's perspective. Potiphar gave him free reign over everything except his wife. Zion. And it ended by telling us he was a very handsome young man. Zion, and it was soon came to pass that after Yosef's been put in charge of everything, so now his master's wife lifts her eyes towards Yosef, Vatomer, and she says, she demands of him, Shechva imi. I want you to lie with me. I want to be intimate with me. I want to have an affair with you. That's so she starts propositioning Yosef. Ches, Vayimayin, Yosef refused. Vayomer Aleisha Sadunav, and he says, he rebuffs his master's wife. Hein Adoni lo yadai tima babayis. My Gesundheit, my master doesn't know anything about what I'm doing in the house. He totally trusts me. Everything that I have, he completely trusts me. He there's nothing that he suspects me of. He has shown me nothing but favor. He's done everything that he can to help me out. Next pasuk, and we're on page 2. Let me go scroll down to page 2. We're up to Tes. There's nobody in this house who's got more responsibilities or is in charge of me. He has withheld nothing from me. The only thing he has held from me is you, meaning that he trusts me with everything. He says, I've got free reign over everything except for you. And that's because you're his wife. You ought to respect that relationship, and it would be wrong for me to get involved. How can I possibly commit this evil and respond to your seduction and to you propositioning me and say I'm going to agree? Even greater than how disrespectful that would be to your husband, and even greater than the injustice and the ingratitude that would represent, but it would also be a great sin against my God. There's no way I'm going to do this. Good. But she kept after him. She kept needling him day after day after day. And he wouldn't listen. He wouldn't give in to her. To lie with her, or to be with her. The commentary says she tried sweet talking him, saying, okay, if you don't want to actually have an affair, so at least cuddle with me, at least lie with me in bed. And he says, no, I'm not going to get involved with anything because it makes the most sense to avoid, no one, if you're trying to avoid something, we don't set ourselves up for challenges. So Yosef says, no, I'm not even going to do that. He kept backing off, trying to get further away. That's why you see what it says here. Lo shama, he wouldn't listen to her. Lishkav etzla, to lie beside her. Even she was trying to say, okay, so don't be intimate with me. Well, let's do everything but that. He says, no, not going to do that. Liosima, even to be with her, to be near her. He says, no, I'm not going to do that because that's just going to set myself up for greater temptation. Yud Aleph 11. And finally, it came about on a certain day. Yosef comes to the house to do his work. And nobody from the whole household was there that day. It's just him and Eshes Potiphar, the wife, Mrs. Potiphar. Yud Beis. She grabs him by his garments, Lemor, and she demands of him, Shechva imi, lie with me. This is the day we're going to be intimate. So instead of punching her, he had such respect. Instead of saying, get off of my garment, he just basically wiggles out of the garment. So let's say it was his overcoat. So she's holding onto his collar, so he quickly wiggles out of it. And he left that garment in her hand. So even though he's setting himself up to for accusations, he says, I got to get out of here as fast as I can. And he's not going to shove her or anything like that, because that would be disrespectful to get her to let go. So his only option, as far as he sees it, is to wiggle out of that trench coat and get out of there. And he escapes, he runs, he gets out of there. And we know how the story plays out. She's left with his garment, and she starts making these accusations against him, saying that he came to the house, he tried to attack me, and when I started screaming, he ran away, and that's why I'm left with his coat. That was the accusation that the wife of Potiphar made, and he finds himself then locked up in prison. But what we see from Yosef, and this is how he earned the title Hatzadik. Yosef is always referred to as Yosef Hatzadik, Yosef the righteous one, because he withstood temptation. This must have been an incredible challenge that he faced, and he found the strength to withstand it. And that's why throughout Jewish literature, he's always referred to as Yosef Hatzadik, Yosef the righteous one, because he's a role model to us for having found the strength to overcome what must have been an incredibly tempting situation. I want to share with you something I was not aware, I don't think I was aware of until this year. There's a sefer that's out there. We know, we're all familiar with the Chafetz Chaim. Rabbi Yisrael Meir Cohen died in 1933. incredible tzaddik, leader of Jewry, as well as a massive Talmud Chacham. And his works are still studied to this day. His most known works are his book called Chafetz Chaim. That was an early work of his. That's how he earned that nickname. And that was a book that he wrote about Lashon Hara, the laws of forbidden speech. It was the first work that had a comprehensive study that ever been done that way. Just really impressed people. That's how he earned that nickname. He also wrote Mishnah Brura, a halachic work that, again, you'll find in homes and in study, Batei Midrash study halls around the world. But here's a book that many of us may not be familiar. It's called Nidchei Yisrael. And you see there, I've got the title page. Nidchei Yisrael. Let me tell you a little bit about this book. It was published in 1893. So this is published 40 years before he passed away. And this is a time where Jews were getting out of Eastern Europe as fast as they possibly could. There were Jews who were trying to get to America, to South Africa, to Australia, getting out of Europe. They were miserable in Europe. It was becoming impossible to earn a living there. There was extreme poverty. There was such persecution. There were the pogroms that were taking place in Tsarist Russia. There was anti-Semitism. And Jews were saying, we had enough. And they started to see opportunities opening up at other far-flung parts of the world where there really weren't much in the way of established Jewish communities where they could have a religious infrastructure. And Jews started moving en masse to these places. The one that we're all familiar with is America. This is when the massive waves of immigration began. And Chafetz Chaim wrote this book, Nidchei Yisrael, which was a book written for Jews. Nidchei Yisrael basically means the scattered of Israel, where he was writing this sefer. Now, again, to have appreciated this book meant you were a Hebrew speaker. So he tells you about his audience. Jews who were leaving Europe were probably all Yiddish speakers, but they recognized Hebrew. And he was basically writing this book was to encourage them, even if you found yourself in a far-flung place in this world that does not have an established Jewish community, that doesn't have halachic infrastructure, what can you do to still, to the best of your abilities, observe the Torah and observe the mitzvahs? That was really the thrust of Nidchei Yisrael, as well as trying his best to encourage Jews, don't put yourself out there in places that don't have a community, don't have an infrastructure, because it's not going to take long until just inevitable is going to happen. You're going to start abandoning Jewish practice. Your kids are going to get lost. So it was a multi-pronged approach in this Nidchei Yisrael. First, he was trying to encourage Jews not to put themselves out in the boondocks away from established Jewish communities, but to live amongst other Jews where they could have that supportive sense of community and that environment that was needed for one another and certainly for their children. But he was also trying to offer some plain speaking guidance, because he says, I know you're not going to have time to go look through all of Shulchan Aruch to figure out halachos, but basically, what basic guidance can I give you how to live authentic Jewish halachic lives, even when one found themselves away from major Jewish communities of Europe where Jews had been living for hundreds of years. That was the thrust of Nidchei Yisrael here. I saw an edition of it once. I remember I was visiting my parents in Cleveland when I was still single. I was in yeshiva, and I was studying in there was a small base medrash near my parents' house, and I was there, and they had an edition of this that was translated into English by one of the Chafetz Chaim's sons. I think he had a son whose name was Aaron, and Aaron found himself in America. I don't know fully. I once read something a little bit about his story, his history. I think he was a son from the Chafetz Chaim's second wife, and he found himself in America, and he translated it and was selling it as a published work, both in the Hebrew and the English. It was also translated into Yiddish because there was a lot of Jews who were more comfortable in Yiddish than they were in Hebrew. And it seems as if for a number of Jews, this actually became their book of guidance when they found themselves in the New World. And this is just the background as to what the Sefer Nidchei Yisrael was. So I assumed that this is all about halachic guidance. But when you look through the Sefer, what you find is there's also a lot of ethical teachings in there, where he's trying to give chizuk. He's trying to encourage Jews who, even though they're no longer in Europe, in those communities where their families have lived and thrived for centuries, now they found themselves in a new world. And the easiest thing to do is to walk away from tradition. He was doing a lot in this Sefer to encourage people to maintain Torah and mitzvah observance, and also trying to speak to them about how they can withstand some challenges that they may be experiencing. Which brings us, if we turn to page 3, it brings us to chapter 23, Perach Chaf Gimel in Nidchei Yisrael. I saw it quoted, and this was news to me. So this chapter is all about trying to encourage Jews to withstand the temptations they may find themselves to get involved in illicit relationships. Saying now that you find yourselves outside of the social environment that you were used to back home, and you might find opportunities that are out there. The Chafetz Chaim, even though he was sitting in the yeshiva all day, he was fully aware of what lurks in the mind of man, and how dangerous it could be for someone to find themselves, if what may have been preventing a person from falling to temptation or to sin may have been the fact, well, everyone knows me and everyone's looking out for me. Now someone finds themselves in a completely new land where they don't have someone looking over their shoulders, they don't have their family and friends looking out for them. There's an incredible amount of opportunities that they can get themselves in trouble with. So in this chapter 23, he's encouraging people to hold strong just because we're in a new land, away from whatever factors may have been stopping a person from getting caught up in sin and temptation back in the old country. Hold strong in the new country, in the new world as well. That's what's going on in Chaf Gimel. Let's see we'll just see the heading of Chaf Gimel. It says Beperek Zeh Yivuar. In this chapter, it'll be explained Godel Schar Adam. How great is the heavenly reward? He's going to go through all sorts of sources and Chazal teachings and Gemara and Medrash about how much God is going to reward someone who finds the strength to stand up and say, I'm not going to succumb to sin. Sheshomer atzmo mizeh, who basically protects themselves from falling into sin. He's talking about illicit relationships. And he says, I'm going to bring down many sources that talk about how great the reward is for someone who finds the strength to do this. First sentence, it says, now I'm going to explain based on what I could find in the sources, in the Gemara, in the Mishnah, in the Medrash, how great the reward, the heavenly reward is for someone who finds the strength to hold strong. Now, I'm skipping a bit, but in that second paragraph that you see there, the last two words on the line, he's going to point to Yosef HaTzadik, how Yosef could be the inspiration for all Jews throughout history who ever find themselves in a situation of temptation. So at the end of that first paragraph there, the last two words, Bo'arei, come and see, Bamez Zacha Yosef Losa Gedula. How did Yosef, in the eyes of Chazal, in the eyes of our sages, what merit did Yosef have that enabled him to achieve greatness? Bishvil Shekavash Yitzro. It's because he was able to overpower his evil inclination. In this week's Parsha, that he said no, and he ran away from the wife of Potiphar. Umasar Nafsho, he actually was willing to suffer the consequences. Kedei Lasos Ritzon Kono. He ended up in jail. He ran away. He says, I'm out of here. And he left his coat there. He didn't even want to pull, to push or shove or get his coat back. He was Moser Nefesh. He really sacrificed himself in order to fulfill God's will, which was not to sin with this married woman. He pascha oso b'chol yom v'yom. She was, or pizza. She was trying to seduce him day after day after day. Bekama mine pituyim, with all sorts of means of seduction. The iyumim, and she was trying to frighten him. Kirisa b'medrash. The medrash really goes at great length to say all the techniques and all the attempts that the wife of Potiphar made to seduce Yosef. Sharmalo, for example, the Medrash says she said to him, Imlo tishmali, if you don't listen to me, hareni chavoshcha, I will imprison you bebeis ha'asurim. I will imprison you in jail. V'ana, Yosef responds in the Medrash, Alzeh, Hashem matir asurim. I'm not scared about that. We say in our brachos every day that God frees those who are in prison. So you know what? If you're going to stick me in prison, I rely on God. He'll eventually get me out. And then she threatens, Hareni ma'aver einecha, I will blind you, I'll gouge your eyes out. Va'ana, and Yosef says, be that as it may, Hashem pokeach ivrim. God opens up the eyes of those who are blind. So you might punish me in some way, but I have my faith in God. Hareni kofef komascha. She says, I'm going to basically have you bent over and ruin you. In other words, I read about this, that this was something that the British used to do, and it's amazing to see that the Medrash brings this down, that back in the day before antibiotics, if you were going to make someone bleed, they were most likely going to develop an infection and going to die. So if you were trying to torture someone, and you wanted them to live with that pain, and you wanted them to live to be an example about what happens if you mess with the crown, you had to come up with some kind of creative way to torture the person and that the person shouldn't die of infection. So a brother-in-law of mine once told me he was touring London Towers, and he said it was just absolutely shocking to him. They took him to like a torture chamber there. They were showing how did the royals, what did someone back in the day, if they wanted to torture someone, do it. And he said he was really surprised because they had all these ingenious, sadistic ways to torture people that did not involve cutting them or breaking skin, because they understood infection would set in, the guy would die. And if you wanted the person to go through life as a cripple or having basically his life ruined, to be a walking example for the world about what happens if you get on the bad side of the authorities, you have to come up with a creative way to break the person, but not let him get an infection. So one of the things he said they explained there was they basically had this small box that they would force someone into. Either what they would do is break a couple of bones to make the person fit in there, or if the person could fit without breaking the bones, they would just shove them in there and leave them in this box for like months on end till all their muscles and their body all tightened up. And when they finally let the person out, they were a contorted mess because they had been forced into that tight space and lived there for so long. So for the rest of their life, they were walking around a contorted mess, or if they were walking at all. And now this person was a living, walking, breathing example of what happens if you get on the bad side of the law. He said he was just shocked to see this. It's not in his mind. That's not what he thought torture was. He's thinking, blood, guts, gore and stuff. But then, no, that would kill the person. That wouldn't serve. That was what the tour guide was saying. That wouldn't serve the goal of being a long-standing. It's awful. What a brutal world. But that seems to be what the Medrash is referring to. Her threat to him now is, Hareni kofef komascha. I'm going to basically injure you in such a way that's going to break you that you will not stand upright. In other words, you'll continue to live, but your posture will be broken. You will not stand upright. I don't know if that means going to break your bones or contort you like what the British were doing in London Tower. Vana Yosef responds, Hashem zokef kifufim. We say in our brachos in the morning that God straightens out those who are bent. So even if you want to do that to me, I've got my trust in God that he'll look after me. And even after Yosef was still locked up in jail, she still snuck in and still tried to seduce him, the Medrash says. Even though he was in jail and he saw himself as locked up and seemingly he could have given up hope, and the Medrash says she kept coming to jail, basically saying, oh, you're in that nasty little cell. I can take care of you. There's a presidential suite over here. She was still trying to seduce him when he was in prison. And she was still trying to seduce him. And even with all that, Yosef Yosef held strong and he never gave in to temptation. And he kept putting his faith in God, that God would eventually help him. And the Medrash goes on to say that's why Yosef received so many of the great rewards that he did. He was put in this unbelievable position of temptation to sin, and he held strong. So the Chafetz Chaim is basically saying over here that Yosef should be the example for every Jew, because none of us are going to find ourselves threatened to this degree to engage in illicit behavior. Temptation lurks around the corner for everyone, but what Yosef had to put up with was astonishing, and he held strong. And according to our sages, that's why he was rewarded to the degree that he was, so by God. So therefore, all of us should look to him as an example of what we should be doing. Now let's skip to this next paragraph. This is later in that chapter. This is what I was unaware of. End of that first line. The Nimtza B'Sfarim. It's brought down in books. Al Hagon Bal Halavush, about the genius, the author of the halachic work called the Lavush. Let's pause for a minute. Look at the paragraph I have beneath this. This is from Wikipedia. It tells us a brief biography. Who was the Lavush? Rav Mordechai Avram Yaffe, or Jaffe. Look when he lived, 1530 to 1612. So he's a very early Achron. Very early. He was a contemporary and a student of the Ramah, the famous Rav Moshe Isserles. So it says, was a rabbi, Rosh Yeshiva, and Posek. He is best known as the author of Levush Malchus, a 10-volume codification of Jewish law that particularly stressed the customs of Jews of Eastern Europe. He is known as the Levush, or the Bala Levushim, the author of the Levush for this work. So let's go back up now what the Chafetz Chaim says about him. I was not aware of, I don't think I was aware of this biographical detail. So back in the paragraph above, end of the first line, V'nimtza. It's brought down in Svarim. It sounds like the Chavetz Chaim says this was a well-known detail. It's brought down in books, Alagon Bala Lavush, about the genius, the author of the Lavush, this Rav Mordechai Yafi. Shelakach zacha min hashemayim la'asos hachiburim hanechmadim shelo. That what merit did he have that he should have been so fortunate to have composed these works that continue? Jews, here we are almost 500 years later, and Jews are continuing to study his works of the Lavush. He's quoted in any halachic discussion. He's a force to be reckoned with, and people will turn to his works. So what merit did he have that God gave him this? So he says it's brought down in Sfarim. I guess the Lavush himself had told us so, and his students must have recorded this. Vehem Sifrei Lavushim. What are his works that are so beloved by the Jewish people? They're the works called the Lavushim. It's a 10-volume set. What did he do to earn this? He must have told his family and his descendants and his students the following idea. Shapam achas, there was one time in his life, Bimei Bachrusa, when he was a young man, and his I guess his blood was all red, his temptation was out there. He was in the days of his youth. Hayalo nisayon gadol. He was faced with an incredible challenge. What happened? Shaba etzel duchsis achas. He once found himself at the house of a duchess, of a non-Jewish noblewoman. Lischor schora. He was selling some goods. So he must have been in his youth making some money on the summer job, whatever it was. I don't know if this was while he was a student or maybe as a young man. So between all of his learning and between all of his halachic works, he had to support himself. So he was selling some goods. I don't know what those goods were. And he once found himself at the house of this certain duchess, some noblewoman. Upitzo sol avera. And she was taken by Rav Mordechai Yafi, how handsome he was. And she did everything. She pulled out all the stops to try to seduce him. And he tried to escape, to get out of there. And he realized, there's no way out of this house. She locked all the doors. So he's locked in the house or in the courtyard. He can't get out and he's got to get away. She's doing everything she can to try to seduce him. The only exit was going underneath the Beis HaKisei. Beis HaKisei is the outhouse, was the bathroom. Back then, there was no indoor plumbing. So what happened? There was a shack, and there was a filthy cesspool beneath it that was filled with all the waste. And some of them may have actually had, like there was a canal that led out of there, out of the property. It may have flowed out of there. He realizes that's the only way out because all the doors to the house are locked. The gates to the courtyard are locked. The only escape, because she's after me, the only escape is to go and crawl through the outhouse, through all the schmutz, through all the feces, through all the waste in there. And he degraded himself, and he decided, I have to escape, and he escaped using this route, going through the outhouse, through sledging through all the sewage. Habizoyanal, through that terrible, could you imagine how disgusting, how filthy, how smelly he was? He was wearing many different clothing. Think about it, on a regular day. You got your underwear, undershirt, you got your shirt, your pants, your socks. He probably had a coat, could have had a sweater on, a scarf. He had all sorts of clothing. And they were made filthy and disgusting. It wasn't like you could just take them to the cleaners back then. And he ruined all of them. He saw this. This was why he merited Mina Shamayim l'chibur halevushim, to put together that set of work called the levushim. Now, it's no accident that he named his book levushim, clothing. What is he saying? There was this tradition. He lost, and this is back in the 1500s. It wasn't like you could just go to Walmart and buy another sweater. Clothes were precious back then. And here he's living in poverty. He lost a full, like his whole getup. He lost a full wardrobe in such a degrading way because he was trying to flee, to get away from Nisayan, to get away from sin. So it sounds like he saw that as God was going to reward him. That's why he merited. It sounds like his learning took off after this point, and that's why he merited to write this 10-volume halachic set. It would be interesting to know if he was wearing 10 items of clothing. That's what I'm saying, like, socks, pants, maybe he had a pair of long johns on, just go through. It's a cold European place. You can maybe have 10 items of clothing, a vest, all these things. But I never had seen this before. Do you hear about these great rabbis? You just assume, okay, they were born an angel and, just engaged in learning his whole life. Here he was. This is what he apparently had told him. The Chafetz Chaim's bringing this down as a way to encourage. Never saw this before. I saw a sefer, though, that quotes, and we're going to go to the next page. It basically brought this down, but then added another detail to this. This is wild. I found this sefer quote. I found it online. It's called Ish Chasidecha. It was written by Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Bender. You'll see there on page 4. There's a brief bio of him. He was a very pivotal member of the Breslov community. We're familiar of the Breslov Hasidim. Their Rabbi Nachman, is buried in Uman in the Ukraine. So this is one of the early Breslov Hasidim who really played a very big role in bringing the teachings of Rav Nachman to the world. I was not familiar with him. I'm just not a devotee of Breslov Hasidus. I don't know anything about him. So I had to look him up. Who was this person? And you'll see here a fascinating piece there. But anyhow, in his book, the Sefer, Ish Chasidecha, it's all about this Rav Levi Yitzchak Bender, and they bring down something about that relates to this story. It gives another detail. In other words, the Chafetz Chaim didn't bring this down. He brings down another piece to the story, another layer. Let's just see this. So this is on pages 13 and 14 in that Sefer, and he brings down that when he was learning in yeshiva as a young man, there was a fellow in the yeshiva who was a genius. His name was Rabbi Yitzchak. They called him Yitzchako. Isaacol. So this Isaacol, and apparently he was a genius, this Isaacol, and he also was very, very handsome. So let's go to page 5, and he brings down a wild story about this Isaacol. So he says, Be'esahi, it was at that time, al saf his partsusa shamochem solam arishona. Around the time that World War I broke out, higiu horim rabim liyeshiva, many parents came to the yeshiva to take their kids home. The whole Europe's going up in flames. They don't want their kids in this yeshiva, so the parents start showing up to take their kids back to their hometowns. That they should be around their parents. We'll keep an eye on you. We have no idea how you'll protect yourself if you're on your own. In the yeshiva, come home with us. So this Rabbi Yitzchak, who they all loved, who was a genius, this handsome young man, his father shows up to pick him up, the Matorah Mura, to bring him home. Lamara Pnei Av, as soon as they saw, or on page 5, as soon as they saw the father, Nidhamu Abachurim, everyone was astonished to see, you're Yitzchakol's father? To me, what astonished everyone? There was a huge difference between the father and son. And he goes on to say that basically what? The father was an exceedingly hideous-looking person, both in terms of his stature, in terms of his appearance, in terms of his facial features. It almost saying like the father just hurt to look at, but the son was this like Hollywood movie star. This Yitzchak was so handsome. And someone said to Yitzchak, like, how do you explain this? Like, you're just this hunk of a guy. You're this really handsome young man. And no offense or nothing, but your dad's a pretty scary looking individual. What do you attribute this to? And this Yitzchak said, I'll tell you what our family tradition is. We are from the family of the Lavush. We are descendants of Rav Mordechai Yafi. And let me tell you something about my great Zayder, Rav Mordechai Yafi. He basically tells over the story from the Chafetz Chaim that he was an exceedingly handsome man. That could be why the lesson was Yafi, because Yafeh means it was beautiful. It could be that's why the lesson was Yafi. And he says, he brought this story down about how he escaped from that duchess who was trying to seduce him, had to go through the drainage canal for the latrine, and all that stuff. And he said as follows, after everything, he said as follows. He said that he prayed to God. He says, I don't want any of my kids to ever have to go through what I did. So let's look the third paragraph from the bottom. It starts with Ba'oso Shah. It's third paragraph from the bottom. Ba'oso Shah Nasa Rav Mordechai Tfilasah Shemaima. So Mordechai, this Rav Mordechai Yafi turns to heaven and he says, I don't want my kids to ever experience such a challenge. I found the strength to get through this. I don't know if my kids could. And this is what he requested of God. Asara Doros Habayim Shiyatsu Memenu. For the next 10 generations of my descendants, Michu Arim Yu Lamara. please make them unseemly, make them ugly, make them as ugly as possible. This way, no one will ever try to seduce them. It's such a challenge being handsome. He says, you bless me with these good looks. These women are throwing themselves at me. I found this incredible gevura, the strength to get through it. I don't know if my kids can. I'm begging you, make the next 10 generations, make them incredibly unseemingly, just make them ugly. So nobody would be take interest in them. And they will never be in a position of temptation based on their exceptional external appearances. So Aseres Hadoros Hisyasmu Eitz Lavi. So this Yitzchak said, my dad, we've done the math. My dad is generation number 10. And he says, Siem Rav Yitzchak as a Sipur Anora, and he says, that's how this Yitzchak finished the story. From me, Maskil Hador Achad Asar. I start generation 11. So he said that's how he explained to this Levi Yitzchak. How do you explain the fact that you're this handsome, extremely handsome young man? Everyone in yeshiva thinks besides for being got such a good head on your shoulder, you're just you got that square jaw. You're just everything about you is screaming Hollywood, and your dad looks like this. And that's what he says here. So again, that's just another piece to the story. I've never heard of this before. Just I thought that was wild. But again, something like this can give all of us inspiration if we know. And he was obviously very public about this. Chafetz Chaim was writing about this. That means that the Levush of Mordechai Yaakov didn't keep this incident to himself. He told his family, he told his students, and apparently it was written up. That's why Chafetz Chaim is just bringing this down. It's brought down, so I'm going to repeat it. And he was giving this as a inspirational notice to the Jews who found themselves outside of established Jewish communities, trying to say, please emulate Yosef HaTzadik, please emulate the Levush. Totally new to me, but a fascinating piece of Jewish history. Okay, that has to do with Parshas Vayeshev. And the time that's left, I want to share with you something beautiful I saw this week that relates to Chanukah. And what's so cool about this is that it mentions a source that we spoke about a few weeks ago. So we're gonna bring this down. We read last week was Parshas Vayishlach, and before Vayishlach was Toldos. At the end of Toldos, what happened? At the end of Toldos, we had Toldos, Vayetze, and then Vayishlach. So at the end of Toldos, Yaakov had stolen the brachos from Esav. So his parents said, "Get out of here! Esav wants to kill you." And Yitzchak gave him another mission: go back to Haran to take a wife. That's the end of Toldos. Vayetze comes along that he leaves Israel, he leaves Beersheba, he goes to Haran. He stops in the place where the Beis Hamikdash is going to be built. They have his sleep. He has a prophetic dream. He wakes up in the morning and he anoints that rock with oil. And the question was, why did he anoint it with oil? So we saw a source that said, because he wanted to mark it. When he eventually comes back to Israel, he made a pledge to God that I want to build a mizbeach, I want to build an altar to worship you. I want to, here where I had this prophetic vision, which was the spot of Beis Hamikdash, how am I going to mark it? I have to pick something permanent that's not going to get ruined by the elements. So if he just would hang Scotch tape a sign to it, all the rain in the winter and the wind's going to blow it away. But if he pours oil on top, we all know oil stains. How many clothing have we all ruined? And carpets have oil stains in it. So oil stains, that's why Yaakov did that. That's what we saw some of the commentators say. And then we had a question, but where did he have oil from? We said that Eliphaz, who was the son of Esav, wanted to kill him. And Yaakov talked him out of it by saying, Ani chashuv kames, someone who's broke is considered as if they're dead. So this way you can tell your father Esav that you fulfilled his instructions. You left Yaakov as a dead man, but you feel you don't want to kill me because you remember, first of all, I'm your uncle, but also you grew up around Yitzchak and you know that's against Yitzchak values. So this way you can, so to say, you can have it both ways. You can have your cake and eat it too. You can tell your father that you fulfilled his instructions, but you don't have to go through life of feeling that you did something wrong by killing your uncle because you didn't kill me. You just left me as a pauper. He stole everything. So we saw one of the commentators ask, okay, so if he stole everything, where did Yaakov have oil from to anoint that? And we saw a source that answered it, but let's first jump right here, and you'll see that this is what got me so excited that I saw he quoted that source and he connects it to Chanukah. So let's see. So this is from the most recent Torah Ladas was a number of Sfarim, was based first on Parsha sheets that was written by Rabbi Matis Bloom. Unfortunately, Rabbi Bloom passed away at the beginning of the first wave of the COVID pandemic. His family put this together after he died. It was a volume called Ner Matisyahu. Ner Matisyo, they put together after he died. So let's see what this is. I saw in the Chanukah section. So let's see this quickly. It says, Lama Sider Rav Achai Gon as Hilchos Chanukah Parshas Vayeshlach. So there he says, B'She'iltos Rav Achai Gon. So one of the Gaonim, this is at that period of time between when the Gemara was written, before the Rishonim. So very, very early pre-Middle Ages, Rav Achai Gon. So he wrote something called the She'iltos, where he basically has on the Parshios HaShavua, he brings down questions and he goes into halachic discourses. So he says in the She'iltos, Muvos Hilchos Chanukah, he says it's very strange that all the laws of Chanukah, Rav Achai Gon brings down the Parshas Vayishlach. Chanukah never falls in Parshas Vayishlach. It falls in this week Vayeshev, and sometimes in next week's Parsha Miketz. Never falls in Vayishlach. So a lot of our commentators have wondered, Rav Achai Gon wasn't foolish. Why did he stick the laws of Chanukah in Parshas Vayishlach? What connection is there between Vayishlach and Chanukah? V'yesh lahavin, lama sida Rav Achai Gon as halchos Chanukah in Parshas Vayishlach. Im liolam lo chal Chanukah, but Parshas Chanukah never falls in Vayishlach. So why would he have stuck it there? Afilu b'shavua shebein Parshas Vayishlach la Parshas Vayeshev, and even in a year, in a week, where it never falls out between the Parsha of Vayishlach and Vayeshev. It doesn't happen. So why would he have stuck the laws of Chanukah with Vayishlach? Seems to indicate there's something in Vayishlach that has to do with Chanukah. So he says, "V'hinei ala pasuk ki b'makli avarti es hayarden hazeh." In Parshas, we read this last week in Vayishlach that Yaakov gives a prayer to God. He says, "When I left Israel, all I had was my staff, my walking staff." Perish Rashi, lo haya imi shuv davar el makli uvado. All I had when I left Israel to go to Uncle Lavan's house was my walking stick. The Medrash Hagadol, and there's a Medrash that says, Isa b'chitala al daitcha sheshilucho avivrekam. Could it be that Yitzchak sent him with nothing? How could it be that Yaakov was so broke that when he's leaving Israel, all he has is his walking stick? His father Yitzchak was a wealthy man. He told him to go to Uncle Lavan. He didn't send him with goods. Ela shekadmu Eliphaz b'derech. So what must it be? Eliphaz mugged him. He carjacked him on the way. Uvikesh largo wanted to kill him. And what did he say? That's when Yaakov talks him out of it. He says, "Don't kill me. Just take all my belongings, and that way you can have your cake and eat it too." He took all of his money, and he continued on his way broke. Nothing. That's all he had was his walking stick. That's what the Medrash says, and Rashi quotes that. Okay. Why was it so important that he has to have his walking stick? In other words, he tells Eliphaz, "Take all my stuff. All I need is my walking stick. You can have everything else." Why do you need that walking stick? Second question. There's another question. If Eliphaz took all of his belongings, how did Yaakov have oil to spill on the matzeva, on the monument he set up when he woke up from that dream? When he woke up in the morning, he took the rock that he had been sleeping on, he stood it upright, and he poured oil on it. But if Eliphaz stole all his stuff and all he's got is his walking stick, how did he have oil? Next paragraph. So the Parshas Vayetze, so we learned this together, that in Parshas Vayetze, ala pasuk, Vayitzok shemen al rosho, that he poured oil. It says there, Kasav Paneach Raza, this was a Rishon who says, where did Yaakov have the oil from? To Maklo Nishalo. He still had his staff, his walking stick. Makli Avarti. His walking stick had an empty spot in it. And it was like a flask that he used it to have oil. So he would always have oil at night that he could light a lantern to learn. He didn't want to stop being productive when the sun went down. He wanted to continue being productive and learning Torah. So he had oil. So I was fascinated by this. We talked about this a few weeks ago. I talked about Grandpa Abe, my grandpa, that he had cigars that were not cigars. They were test tubes. During the Prohibition, they were wrapped with tobacco leaves to make them look like cigars, but they were basically test tubes, so he could have a couple shots of schnapps and whiskey when he wanted to get together with his friends. So I said that made me think of Grandpa Abe and those test tubes that we found after Grandpa Abe died. Okay, that's what I got. Now let's connect this to Chanukah. This is amazing what he does. V'hinei ala pasuk. This is a little later in Rabbi Bloom's piece. V'hinei ala pasuk. Vayivasar Yaakov levado. Last week in Vayishlach, it says that Yaakov was left all alone at night when he was wrestling with Esav's angels. So it says over there, Kosev Rashi. Rashi brings down in the name of the sages, Mishem Chazal, Shachach Pakim Ketanim. He forgot little flasks. V'chazar aleim, and he went back for them. In other words, why was Yaakov all by himself? Because remember, they split up the camp and he went to cross the river. He says, oops, I forgot something back there. I got to go get him. What did he go back for? Little flasks. Pachim ketanim. Uvedas zekenim isa. And the Bali Tosos, in their commentary, they write, Samach l'davar michsiv levado. It says, Usmach l'davar. There's a hint to this. It says levado. It says that Yaakov was by himself. Al tikri levado. Don't read it levado. It looks very much like Ella likado. Why did Yaakov go back? He went back likado for his flasks. Davar acher, another idea, lashon beis habad. Another thing is that the word levado is related. Beis habad is a pressing house. That's where you make olive oil. You got to press the olives. Levado, the root of the word is bad, so it seems to indicate something about a pressing house. Shemoshchen mimenu shemen zayis. That's where you press the olives to draw the oil out. The derechu latzniya shemen pachim ketanim. So he's saying that Dasakim is bringing down. Yes, he went back for small flasks. What was in those small flasks? Oil. So in other words, Yaakov, he's got this thing for oil. When he's going marching, he says to Levites, you can take everything. Don't take my staff because that staff has oil. When he's on his way back to Israel, he says, oh my God, I forgot pachim ketanim, little jugs, little flasks. They were so important, he had to cross the river, be all by himself, and that's where he gets jumped by Esav's angels. What was in those pachim ketanim? Again, oil. There's something about Yaakov that he feels he needs to have oil. Why? Because it's that oil that at night that he could learn Torah. He needs that oil to be the fuel for his lanterns because he wants to be productive even when the sun goes down. The Sefer Tzedel L'Derech al Perish Rashi. So there's a commentary on Rashi called Tzedel L'Derech. Muva Mirabo Marshal. He brings down from his Rabbi, his teacher, the Marshal. Shechazar Yaakov al Pachim Ketanim. Why did Yaakov go back for the small flasks? He risked his life for them. Because there was oil in them. He either wanted oil because when he to learn Torah at night, or when he goes back to Israel, he had promised that I'm going to bring libations. He wants to bring libations on that altar. He went back because he had already pledged to use that oil to anoint the Mizbeach with. So it's not mine. If it was just mine, I could say, you know what, I forgot it there, I'll leave it. But it's not mine. I had pledged this was going to be used in God's service. I got to go back for it. The Kosev B'Shem HaMarshal, so he writes in the name of the Marshal, Yaakov. God says to Yaakov, Ata masarta nafshecha pachkotam b'shvili. You risked your life to go retrieve those small flasks for my sake, so you could pour the libations of oil, or so you could have oil to learn Torah. V'gam ani ba'atzmi ashalem lebenecha. I pledge that I will repay your descendants b'pach katan, with another small flask. Where in the Chanukah story do we see a small flask? That after they beat the Chashmonaim, beat the Yevanim, what did they find in the Beis Hamikdash? One small flask of oil for the menorah. So God says to Yaakov, you were so into having these small flasks of oil. Either it was on your way in order to have fuel for your lantern so you can learn Torah at night, or on your way back to Israel so you can anoint the Mizbeach, and you did that for me, and you risked your life for that small flask. I'm going to make sure that your descendants will also find a small flask, the descendants of the Chashmonai, that a great miracle will happen through a small flask, and that's what happens. Now let's skip to the end of his piece here. Now, maybe based on this, now that we see that this is so special about Yaakov, that he was going back for that small flask because he had pleasure to God, now we can better understand one line in Ma'oz Tzur, what we sing after we light the menorah. It says, Uminosar kan kanim, and from the remainder of those pitchers, Nasa Nes Shoshanim, a miracle was done for the Shoshanim, for the blossoms, meaning those Kohanim, the Chashmonaim. That's how the plain reading would be. So he says maybe we can say it means a little more now. What does it mean? Uminosar kan kanim, bizchus, in the merit of Misha Nosar Levado, in the merit of the one who has remained all by himself, lachzor al kan kanim, to go get those little flasks of oil. In his merit, Nasa Nes LaShoshanim. In his merit, the miracle was done for those blossoms. Zachu Yisrael Nes Hapach B'mei Chashmonaim. That's where the Chashmonaim. Why did they merit having that? Was because Yaakov had sent himself back and put himself out for it. He says maybe that's what's being hinted at. So getting back to his original question, he says now we can make a connection. Why did Rav Achai go and stick the halachos of Chanukah into Parshas Vayishlach? If the whole story, celebration of Chanukah never falls in Parshas Vayishlach, why did he place them there? Because he says in Vayishlach there's an allusion, there's something about it. In the merit of Yaakov, Shemasar Nafsho, who was willing to risk his life, ala Shemen, Shebemakalo, Yaakov was the one who was willing to risk his life for the oil in his that he kept in that little flask inside of his staff, so he could learn at night. And also in the merit that he was willing to go back all alone for the small jugs of oil, that he needed that in order to anoint the mizbeach and pour libations, for everything in the future. That's why his kids, the descendants, were merited to have that little flask of oil in the days of the Chashmonaim. That's at the root. The whole root of Chanukah is because the Chashmonaim found that flask. But what was what was the seed that planted that? Is in Parshas Vayishlach. That's how he wants to address that. And he ends by saying, Yiratzon may be God's will, Shenizka Liros Nisim V'Neflos, that we should merit, just like our ancestors merited seeing great miracles and salvations, we should also, we need salvations. We all know what's going on in Israel now. We're all following the news. We're all anxious. And we're about to make that bracha of Shechiyanu v'Kimanu v'Giyanu Azman Hazeh. The same HaKadosh Baruch Hu did She'asa Nisim L'Avoseinu. He did incredible miracles for our ancestors. He should also do those miracles nowadays. V'Yikuyam, and it should be fulfilled. Chasov Zerah Kadshecha. The Karev Kates HaYeshua, that God should make come the date, the point of salvation. And here will be Amen, speedily in our days. I thought that was such a fascinating piece there. So I love what he did. He tied in the connection. He created a connection between Parshas Vayishlach and Chanukah, even though the two seemingly don't coincide. He's saying the seed for Chanukah is planted in Parshas Vayishlach, according to that medrash there. And he also gives us a new insight when we sing that in Mos Sur. When we say Umi Nosar Kankanim, Nasa Nesla Shoshanim, that can be talking about Yaakov. Umi Nosar Kankanim, that person who put himself out to be all alone in order to retrieve those little flasks of oil. In his merit, Nasa Nesla Shoshanim. That's why the miracle was done for those blossoms. That's a euphemism for the Kohanim, for the children of Kohanim. That could be another point there. I thought that was very, very cool. So I wanted to share that with you. I'm going to just stop the recording.